And you see some agenda items in the past where we have found violations. The first one seems pretty specific, discuss non-binding referendum public meeting forum, but we found out that was a violation because not only did the public body discuss this matter, but they also took action. So if your agenda says that you're going to discuss something, that means you're only going to discuss it. If your agenda says discussion with possible action, well, then that puts the public on notice that there may be some sort of action being taken. Discussion and possible vote in regards to election legislation in the General Assembly. Again, seems pretty specific, but this related to legislation that was this related to an agenda item before the Board of Elections. There were a number of legislative bills relating to elections that the Board of Elections were putting forth, and basically our at least part of our finding, or part of what I would suggest to you, is why just not say what specific legislation you're going to be discussing? This isn't a situation where a bunch of years ago you had to post notice in a newspaper and you were kind of limited by characters or by cost. There's really no reason not to be more specific. Tim said that you'd be subject to fines and nobody wants that. I'll be more blunt. Nobody wants to deal with me. You can talk to Adam about that. He nods. What's that? I love dealing with Mike. He says winking. And the last one, minutes, tax sales properties, executive session. Again, it just gives no notice of what's going to be discussed. If you can't figure it out and you're on the board what's going to be discussed, you can bet that the public doesn't know. And here are some other agenda items. Most of these have really gone by the wayside because of our past findings. But you see just something that labels old business, new business. That by itself gives no indication what's going to be discussed. If you're going to have subheadings, well, that's okay. That provides some indication. Superintendent's report. You need to give some sort of body or some sort of discussion or notice of what's going to be discussed. And then we've seen from time to time other matters that might come before the board. And we've heard that, well, we want to put that there just in case we want to discuss something else that happens at the last minute. And school committees in particular might be in that situation because you can't amend your agenda more than 48 hours before the meeting, or less than 48 hours before the meeting. But again, if you have no idea what's going to be discussed, then the public doesn't. That's really a sure sign that the notice is insufficient. I want to skip ahead for a second. Your executive session notice, what's going to be discussed in the executive session. We've said in a 1999 finding that your notice has to state if the matter that's going to be discussed is publicly known, then you have to give more notice of what's going to be discussed in the executive session. If it's a public case, for instance, that's been filed in court, you should cite the case name, the case site. If it's well known that the superintendent's contract is being discussed, you should be more specific about that. If it's less known or something that's not known, you can be more general, like litigation or job performance or personnel matters. So your executive session notices can't have boilerplate language, but for what I just mentioned. And the big thing is make sure, and you'll see an example in a second, make sure that your executive session notices indicate for each item that's going to be discussed in executive session a separate matter for each one. And you see here really an example. You don't want to have your agenda item be something like 4246A 1 and 2, because there are certainly situations where you may go into executive session under numerous or multiple exceptions, subsections, to discuss a particular matter. You can do that, and you see that in number 3, but you want to make clear that you're discussing each matter separately, whether it's under one exception like the first 2, or whether it's like number 3 that's under several exceptions, so that the public knows exactly what's being discussed, or the nature of what's being discussed, and how many different matters. You got to use the microphone, otherwise I get in trouble.
In executive session, under personnel, and I would just like a clarification on this issue, that is not a time where the superintendent is allowed to apprise school committee members of situations that have evolved Am I correct in that? It's not a catch-up. Like, let's say I recommend a termination, so prior to that termination, I'm going into executive session, and I'm going to tell them the details of why that is happening without notifying that person that that person is going to be discussed. I have some issues with that personnel.
Well,
I'd like clarified.
It really depends on what's being discussed. So we have definitely have said in past findings that you can't go into executive session under personnel to discuss a position. We're interviewing for the superintendent position. This is without talking about people, these are the qualities we're looking for, or this is what the position looks like, or what we should advertise, because that exception concerns only persons, affected persons. Could a superintendent or could the public body or the school committee discuss a termination matter or some other matter? I think the answer to that question is yes, to the extent that it concerns the job performance, character, or physical or mental health of a person or persons. Now, if it does, you have to provide that person advance written notice. They can have it in open session. But to me, the key phrases are job performance, character, and physical or mental health. So your minutes, and again, this is also on your checklist, have to contain these items. You see what they are here. Your unofficial minutes have to be made available to the public within 35 days of the meeting or at the next regularly scheduled meeting, whichever is earlier. I want to stress that these are your unofficial minutes. We've had many situations where minutes have not been available and we get a complaint and we investigate the complaint and the response is, well, we haven't approved the minutes yet. That doesn't matter. This is your unofficial minutes. So the unofficial, unapproved minutes have to be made available within this time frame. The two exceptions are if they are sealed, and if they're sealed, that would mean that these are executive session minutes only, or the public body extends the time to make the minutes available, and they publicly state the reason why. And one of the reasons, because you look here and it's a 35 days or next regularly scheduled meeting, I use the example, let's just say you have a meeting on the 1st of every month. Well, if you have a special meeting on the 31st of the prior month, well, the unofficial minutes of those meetings have to be made available by the next day. Now, maybe that's possible now, maybe it's not. If it's not, well, then you've got to state in open session, you have to extend the time to file those unofficial minutes and publicly state the reason why.
I have a quick question on that, Mike.
Oops, go ahead, Adam.
So when you talk about a regularly scheduled meeting, if you have two different types of meetings, like for example, in Bristol Warren, we have a regular business meeting at 1, and then 2 weeks later we have a workshop meeting. Is that workshop meeting the point at which those minutes need to be available?
I would say I think the answer to that question is probably going to be consistent with whatever you put out your notice to be at the beginning of the calendar year of what your regular meetings are. I don't know if that workshop I don't know if you're every 15th of the month you're going to meet for a workshop meeting. If that's part of the regular scheduled meeting, then probably. Arguably you might be able to say it's a subcommittee. Probably not, because it's the same body. You're just doing a different topic. So in the exercise of caution, I probably would do that. I'd probably treat it that way.
Thanks.
That's good.
I have a question about subcommittees, ad hoc committees. I'm wondering about whether or not those rise to the same level of formality in terms of these requirements when it comes to minutes, both in terms of when they're published, whether or not they have to be formally approved at the next meeting. Because there's lots of different kinds of subgroups of school committees, and that's something I think we could use clarity around.
The answer is generally yes. Subcommittees are treated the same as the parent committee. They've got to keep minutes. They've got to post notices. Their minutes have to be made available within the same time frame. There are a couple situations, but I don't think that they're going to apply to school committees where a subcommittee or an advisory body might be treated differently. You'll see it in the next slide, but the next slide doesn't apply to school committees. So as a general matter, yes.
And in terms of approval of the minutes at subcommittee
So the question was, the question's about approving minutes, and there's nothing that requires school committees to approve their minutes. School committees are not required to do so. Now, the only thing it does is it starts the statute of limitations. Somebody can bring a complaint, file an open meeting complaint, but the statute of limitations for you is 180 days, is generally 180 days from the time you approve your minutes. So there's no requirement that school committees do it, but it does start the statute of limitations for somebody to file a lawsuit. Okay.
May I just ask, if a public body votes to extend that time period, I presume that it can't continue on indefinitely. Is there a time frame within which it's a reasonable?
Yeah, I think the last word you just mentioned is probably what I say. The Open Meeting Act doesn't say reasonable. It doesn't say couldn't be for more than 20 days. There's no time limit in the Open Meeting Act. You know, in the absence of that, I think it would probably be a reasonable time frame, whatever that means. So we were just talking about the unofficial minutes. Let me just get the next point, because this is where the question about approved minutes comes in. This says that all state and quasi-public boards have to keep approved minutes and file minutes within certain periods of time. This does not apply to school committees. School committees don't fall within this category. So this was the one time period, or the one situation where approved minutes are required and to be posted on the Secretary of State's website. I just bring that out so that you see the full picture, that there's nothing that says that school committees have to post their minutes on the Secretary of State's website. Doesn't mean you can't, but there's no requirement, and there's no requirement to approve your minutes. Again, doesn't mean you can't do so, though.
Mr. Field, executive session minutes that are sealed, is there a requirement, or when should they be unsealed and brought out to the public?
With respect to executive session minutes, there's nothing in the Open Meeting Act that, it's basically called a sunset provision. There's nothing that says those minutes are unsealed after a specific time period. Once they're sealed, they're sealed. It doesn't mean that your public body can't, at some later point, decide to unseal those minutes, but there's nothing in the Open Meeting Act that requires them to be unsealed. There's been some talk from time to time about adding something like that, but as the law stands right now, there's nothing there.
So how are the executive session minutes, are those susceptible to the Freedom of Information Act?
You're beating me to the next presentation. Oh. and I'd like to keep everybody in suspense. Okay. But they're not. They're expressly exempt under the Access to Public Records Act, provided that they are properly sealed.